Is roll call.
Adams.
Here.
Harp.
Here.
Paniro.
Here.
Paulson.
Here.
Summers. Here. Bruce and Sonntag are absent and excused.
Thank you. We have a public hearing on our agenda. It is 7 o'clock. This is a hearing about the request for a conditional use permit for a medical clinic and ambulatory surgery center. The applicant is HGA on behalf of owner Golf Green Storage at 8124 Forsythia Street. Is anyone here to speak? Yes? No? Okay. Do we have any members of the public who would like to speak? Anyone online? Mark, would you like to, did we get any comments on this one?
I'm not aware of any, and Abby probably would have told me if we did, so.
Okay. Last call for comments from the public. Hearing none, we will close the public hearing. It is 7:01. Next item is the Plan Commission minutes of August 27th, 2024. Are there any corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, the minutes as drafted and circulated are approved. Next one is the request for a conditional use permit for a medical clinic and ambulatory surgery center, applicant HGA on behalf of owner Golf Green Storage at 8124 Forsythia Street.
This is a request for a conditional use permit in the Airport Road Business Park PDD, which I attached in your packet. Medical clinics and ambulatory care facilities are listed as a conditional use in this PDD. The applicant is proposing a 15,500 square foot outpatient medical clinic offering exams and diagnostics, outpatient surgeries. They are anticipating normal hours of operation, daytime hours, Monday through Friday, on a very occasional basis due to medical need. They may have a patient that requires a longer stay. But for the most part, it is just normal hours of operation. They expect to see around 20 patients per day. They are currently operating similar facilities in the Dane County area and would be hiring up to 35 employees, mostly new employees for this facility. I had the opportunity to meet with Dan Cowell from Luther Group, Jason from Cypress West, and also their architect from HGA earlier today. They are also here. If you have any questions for the applicants or if you have feedback, and our staff recommendation upon satisfaction of any questions and feedback is to direct staff to compile all materials presented into a report of preliminary recommended findings, which would be considered at your next meeting per your recent direction about not having action the same night as we hold a public hearing.
And we do appreciate that. Thank you. Commissioners?
And our ordinance would seem, our zoning ordinance would seem to imply that there needs to be a second step. I forget the section, Mark, we were talking about this, 10 point.
Would you like to explain, Mark? And also, can you explain why a conditional use permit is needed? This is
Sure.
This is a PUD, correct?
Right. And in the PUD, in the GIP that was approved at the time, actually it was amended at one point. So the standing GIP as amended identified this type of use specifically as a conditional use.
Okay.
It's rather unusual. We have a couple cases like that where the GIP or the GDP, as we now call it, identifies certain land uses as conditional uses. So we felt because of the zoning remaining PUD, we needed to follow the conditional use process, but we're following the conditional use process that's now in our current ordinance, which segues to Commissioner Paulson, 10.10.32 parentheses 7.
And before you read that, may I just ask a clarifying question? So if it is specified, because I did see the attachment in the packet, if it is specified in there, such as these are conditional uses, the applicant has to follow it. But anything that is not laid out in the original development plan, that they do have to comply with, like the minimum and maximum parking or the setback?
Yes, I would, yes.
Okay, that's all.
Yeah, so in other words, the GDP document still is the guiding document for all zoning regulations. intensity, bulk, et cetera, density, that sort of thing.
And they will be bringing forward an SIP
Right.
for review at a future meeting.
Okay.
Which is essentially now the site plan review step.
And that's what you were about to explain?
Yeah, well, so as Commissioner Paulson noted, chapter 10.10.32 or section 10.10.32 parentheses 7 states specifically, following the public hearing, staff shall compile all materials presented to be documented in a report of preliminary recommended findings. The report shall contain at a minimum all substantial evidence presented in the hearing, the recommended findings, and recommended motion to either approve the use as proposed, approve. Anyway, I don't need to go into all the potential options. In the same, it does say in the same or subsequent meeting, the Plan Commission shall discuss the report of preliminary recommended findings. I interpret that to mean that that would be the next meeting or another subsequent meeting. But obviously, we want, in the name of efficiency, we'd want to try and streamline this, especially when there's no input from the public presented at a hearing. I presume that the Plan Commission would be amenable to granting the conditional use. So it's just a procedural step that's in our new zoning ordinance. It continues on. I don't think I need to go read all of that. It's on the screen, actually. Thank you. And
Yeah.
number 8, if you could highlight number 8, please. I'm sorry, Kurt.
Yep.
Final action by the Plan Commission shall consist of the following: the formal findings of fact that Abby Atun mentioned, description of the substantial evidence that supports the overall decision to approve or approve with conditions or deny the request, descriptions of substantial evidence that supports all the conditions imposed by the city, and documenting these proceedings by any of the following means.
Commissioner Paulson.
And that's largely driven by changes in state law a few years ago about how conditional uses are handled.
Right.
So what's interesting is that it's still in the GDP, but it doesn't list any standards. It's just a conditional use back when conditional uses could kind of be approved or denied without any specific standards. So, but I mean, in this case, given the surrounding land uses, it seems obvious that this is in harmony with the comprehensive plan and the general development plan and isn't a traffic or any sort of other nuisance. I guess the only question I would have is a medical clinic defined in our ordinance as implying not an overnight stay? I know that they said it would be very rare to have an overnight stay, but because I know this issue came up when we were doing Miramont, where there were many, there's a difference between a hospital where people stay overnight and a clinic where it's expected to be office hours. But as long as the overnight stay is de minimis relative to the use, it would seem to be not a different use. It would seem to be a clinic.
They had indicated that 99.9% of the time, there would not be a stay after hours. Their state licensing allows a stay of up to 23 hours, but not beyond 23.
Yeah.
And they mentioned that in very rare instances, they may have to transport a patient from their facility to another facility.
Okay. Any other comments, questions from commissioners?
I would simply
Did you
add,
find the
I'm sorry.
reference?
yeah, I would simply add that this would be classified under our commercial land uses section as a personal or professional service, which specifically identifies small scale by appointment medical offices and clinics as an example. So that would be the most compatible use in our zoning ordinance.
I had a question for the applicant, and that is about the parking. I noticed you've got 62 parking stalls planned, and you are not, they're not obligated to follow the parking because that's not,
Right.
yeah. If you have 35 employees planned and 20 patients throughout a day, even if all 20 patients are there at the same time, that's still only 55 stalls. And I'm just wondering, you said, or Abby said, you've got other facilities like this operating in Dane County. So I trust your experience is that you need more parking spaces than people that you're hoping to accommodate in this facility. And could you just explain why, since reducing parking was one of the goals of our zoning ordinance rewrite?
Surface parking specifically.
Surface
Well,
parking.
both, yes.
My name is Jason Anzalone. I'm with Cypress West, the developer of the project. And the 62, we're actually reduced below the kind of national standard for these types of facilities based on the volume and the density. I think we were at 75 based on national standards. Knowing that parking's, something that we don't want to have a massive sea of parking, we did try to reduce it down to a level by which you could have full patient volume, full staff volume, and any ancillary service, fire, life safety access, things like that, for everybody's well-being. So
Okay.
it is, I think, slightly reduced from where it was. I think 70, 75 was kind of the national average of what we do for these facilities.
Okay, thank you. Mark, I have a question for you. Page 14 references our lot coverage ratio. Does that apply to this lot coverage
Of what?
of the packet? The whole packet?
It references lot coverage. Where does it say that?
Let me pull it up on my screen. Page 14. Well, the question is just, okay, here it is. It's under conditional use.
Oh, there it is. Yep.
Yep.
So that would reference the old zoning ordinance was lot coverage based instead of impervious surface area ratio.
It might be from the.
But which chances are references that as well. But yes, that would be a
The
reference.
site plan does show the percent impervious
Right.
in the lower left-hand corner.
I just
Okay,
don't know what
good.
that is off the top of my head. I'm
Yeah.
saying the impervious ratio.
No, it's fine. That's fine. Okay, any further comments, discussion? Mark, go ahead.
No, I was going to
Commissioner
make a
Foster.
motion then. Wait,
I was going to ask, Mark, you said you listed in the agenda, direct staff to compile all materials presented to be documented in a report of preliminary recommended findings. Do you happen to have an outline of the report of preliminary recommended findings?
I do not.
Okay, then I'll entertain a motion.
I was going to make a motion to direct staff to compile all materials presented to be documented in a report of preliminary recommended findings. And that the plan commission approves the conditional use. So to direct staff to prepare findings of fact in support of the conditional use.
Direct staff to prepare findings of fact,
In support of granting.
The conditional use permit.
granting the conditional use permit for a medical clinic, etc.
Do you need direction what those findings of fact are? I mean, it's consistent with the comprehensive plan and consistent with surrounding land uses.
One second. Can we get the second for the motion? Sorry.
Adam's second.
Thank you. All right, now we can discuss. Just to elaborate.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering if that needs to be part of the motion. To say that the findings should indicate consistency with the comp plan
We will include that.
and consistency with surrounding land uses.
Well, I mean, it's,
But no adverse impact, it's whatever's in the
yeah,
ordinance.
I
right?
don't think it needs to be in the motion because you said in support of granting the conditional use permit, so they'll come
Got it.
back with something that supports it. Mark, did you get all the suggestions?
To direct staff to prepare findings of fact in support of granting the conditional use permit and some of the ideas mentioned, which is not part of the motion, as I understand it, is consistency with the comprehensive plan surrounding land uses and no adverse impact. And we'll obviously prepare a more thorough report to
Yep.
support the decision.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. The motion is to direct staff to prepare findings of fact in support of granting the conditional use permit for the medical clinic and ambulatory surgery center at 8124 Forsythia Street. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Moving on, our second action is to review the specific implementation plan modification for Middleton Glen addition at 6720 Century Avenue. Staff have recommended approval as a minor SIP modification. Would someone like to make that motion?
Moved.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Adams a second.
Thank you. Discussion.
Looks nice.
It
I drive
does.
by there every day and it's.
It looks very
it'll be a
nice, and I'm
Nice addition.
very happy to see that it's the needs of our folks who use wheelchairs and other assistive mobility devices are going to be met, because that was a concern expressed by some of my constituents who live at Middleton Glen.
And the applicant wasn't able to make it tonight, so they sent in this letter. But basically it's saying, they wanted that sunroom space, but then it also adds that accessible route for a lot of the wheelchair users. And then they wanted to preserve that there's like a big tree that's right in
Yep.
front of it. And so that was, how they arrived to that configuration.
And if anyone's wondering, it's Pheasant Branch Street, not Branch Street. Because Branch.
Oh,
Street's
yes,
little-
I
Yeah.
saw that too.
Other side.
Just a little shorthand there. Yeah. In the letter that came to us. Okay, so we have a motion and a second to approve the SIP modification for Middleton Glen addition at 6720 Century Avenue as a minor SIP modification. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. All right, moving on to our last item of business. It's the zoning ordinance, chapter 10, continued discussion of potential revisions. Staff, would you like to give us a refresher on why this particular issue is back on the agenda?
Sure, that's a tall order. That's my one for the meeting.
We're trying to elevate the discussion.
Yes. So in all seriousness, we have been obviously wrestling with this now for a few months. We at the previous meeting in July requested I proposed a definition for established grade, which is currently in our ordinance. Or the ordinance as adopted references established grade without defining it. So that was one concern. And then I was also proposing editing the building height definition, and a fair amount of discussions ensued based on input you received from the public, specifically Smart Growth Greater Madison's comments. And you asked for some comparisons with other projects in the city, recently approved projects. So this memo attempts to assess the height of those projects in relation to the language I was proposing. And obviously you got some additional input today from Mr. Connors. I don't know I don't think I need, I guess we could go through each of these. So for Castle Rock, the maximum height under the new zoning. So first of all, that was approved as a PUD. And one of the conditions of approval was that they would accept the new multifamily high density zoning classification. So that height is, the front elevation is 53 feet 4 inches. And the rear elevation, if you take the average between the corners, the northeast and northwest corners essentially, was 5 feet 4 inches below the established grade. So the addition brings that to just under 60 feet, 58.8. There was no requirement for a building step back when the GIP was approved. That's the first one. Maybe if you want to ask questions, maybe.
And by front, you mean
Facing the
street frontage.
front lot line, right?
And how does our ordinance define when a building fronts on two streets?
Well,
It has two fronts?
that's a valid point. And I did
It's an
not think of
ambiguous
it.
point. It's
Well,
not valid.
And this actually just came up today. Daphne and I actually talked about this yesterday. So I think the term you used this morning, which I like, is something called the functional front. So and I've talked with our planning consultant about this recently as well. So our ordinance defines, for a corner, defines the lot frontage as the shorter of the two frontages. And if
Mhm.
they're within 10%, then there's some discretion. So I was thinking of the front as facing University Avenue in this case. So I did not think of it directly as, and I don't have the lot measurements in front of me, but I would imagine that the shorter frontage is Lakeview Avenue. So that's a valid point, Commissioner Paulson.
But if a building fronts on two streets, do we determine which is the front, or does the applicant, or is it
It's
ambiguous in
defined
the
by ordinance, but if it's within 10% of each other, then there's oh, here, I'll just, since you have it. It's here's a lot line which abuts a public or private street right of way. In the case of a lot which has two or more street frontages, the lot line along the street with the shortest frontage shall be the front lot line. In the case of a lot which has two or more street frontages and the dimensions of each are within 10% of being equal, the front lot line shall be the street line designed by the owner and filed in the office of the zoning administrator.
Okay, so.
Well,
But either way, in this case, that side lot line or the lot line facing Lakeview, the shorter frontage under the definition would still comply with the 60-foot. Sorry to interrupt.
well, no, I was just going to say, and you're asking this question because of the calculations that Mark has done to look at
Right.
under the old ordinance definition of building height. The front matters, but
Yeah.
under the current interpretation of what's in our ordinance, it doesn't matter what the front or the back is.
Right, and Bill Connor's reference to Madison, which I'm very familiar with, which we can talk about later, is from the highest point, which is usually the street on which it is fronting for an address purposes, but we're aware of the fact that some redevelopment might be a block wide or block deep parcel.
I think this would be
But we
good.
want to be clear, especially if we're butting up against, yeah.
Yeah. So I, anticipating this was coming up.
I told Mark
Yes.
I was
thank
going to
you.
raise this. we
So
could
I
be
thought
ready.
we better have that ready to go. So this is a great example. This comes from Madison's ordinance. And the height and let's say the front is, it says street on the right, it says street in the bottom left. I'm assuming for this, well, it's a little nebulous, but the street on the right clearly is fronting the building, and then the street, is the street on the back. It looks like it's supposed to be on the back of the building instead of the side. But either way, the ordinance, clearly the building, the height on the front is 5 stories. Let's just refer to stories, not feet in this case. On the back, the appearance, stay up there, please. And on the left side, the building is, I think that's 9 stories.
Yeah.
And so the conundrum we have is the way the ordinance as currently written,
Our ordinance.
our current ordinance, thank
This
you
is
for
Madison's
for
ordinance.
clarifying. Yeah. Our ordinance as currently written is very basic, very straightforward. It says the vertical per building height, the vertical distance from the established grade to, and then it identifies 4 different types of roofs. So basically the vertical distance from the established grade. It doesn't say the established grade at the front lot line or any of the lot lines. So I have interpreted this as being the established grade on any side of the building. I don't know how else to interpret this in a conservative manner.
Sorry to interrupt. So
Yeah.
this, what we're looking at would be a 7-story building.
I would actually say that well, thank you for, so on the front, on the right side, it's 5 stories. On the left side, it's 9 stories. And so what I am proposing, or the formula that I've suggested as one option, would take the 4 corners and conclude that it's a 7-story building, although I would say with respect to each side, well, and the side that's facing us it's a 7-story building. Correct. That's what I have been proposing.
So Mr. Connors points us to this Madison ordinance, which for people's reference is 28.134, as you can see above there. In most Madison districts, this would be considered a 5-story building. And so the 5th story requires a step back. But if I'm living on the street on the western side of this diagram, I think of it as a 9-story building. But as my understanding is the way Mark wrote the draft of the Four Corners approach, it would, I can't draw on this map, but it would require that what we see from the west side is floors 6, 7, 8, and 9 would need to be lopped off in half in proportion to the rise in the slope. Because if the way that Mark proposed it in the draft staff report would interpret this as a 7-story building. So if this was in a 5-story zoning district, it couldn't comply.
Mhm.
But for Madison, they take the height measured from the highest point
In the front.
on the ground. But not in all zoning districts, because in some of their other zoning districts, it's not the same as this. If you scroll down to the next one. So this is again how they would interpret like a 3-story in a residential building. But this is one that does not abut a street on the rear end. It would abut on the back of the parcel would abut a different parcel. So other ordinances I've seen around the country say that you get, if you're measuring average height from the 2 or more grades, that for every foot drop in grade, you get an additional average 6 inches of height. So that you could build, if you scroll up, that if we had a 5-story ordinance, you could build this building if this was the slope. As long as you're not altering the grading on the back end to get more volume. Because you got to take the natural grade. Madison says the natural grade prior to development. So this is why I flagged it from Mark, because is this a 5-story building, a 7-story building, or a 9-story building? That actually really matters to the developers and to the neighbors.
Right. And I
We need
think,
to be clear.
and because of how our ordinance is written, which is based off a template used by our planning consultant and applied in other communities, that the vertical distance from the established grade 2, and it doesn't say the front or any other side specifically. So I feel that if I called this a 5-story building, someone who, if there's street frontage on the west or the left, sorry, we're assuming that that's west. Someone there could argue it's a 9-story building under our current ordinance, and I don't know that we could defend against that as written.
If you go back to the staff report where you showed a bunch of pictures,
Right.
I look at some of those pictures and I say, that's a 4-story building, but there's like half a story that looks like it's a parking structure
Mhm.
that would be visible to someone on that side of the parcel.
I want to make it clear that I'm not opposed to changing the definition of our ordinance to allow for greater density. My job is to interpret the ordinance as written.
Sure.
And to protect the city's interest, to make sure we're being fair and applying the ordinance consistently. I just feel that I cannot, in good conscience, look at the example that was on the screen and say that that's a 5-story building to the people who are left of that building, based on how the ordinance is written. So that's why we're proposing some changes. The the revisions that I've been proposing would actually allow greater density on the site and would allow the step down approach, or for that matter, you could establish 2 buildings, but of course that increases costs when you have multiple additional facades. But it actually is an improvement over what's currently drafted, but it still isn't based on what the original, the previous ordinance, which was in reference to the front lot line. That was how our old ordinance read. And that's how
Say that again.
So the old ordinance-
Our previous ordinance was to the front.
front lot line.
Yeah, that's remember. Yeah.
Well, I confess, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the idea that we would make a decision about this based on what the backyard neighbors may or may not see. I'm trying to think of a situation where I guess if that 9 stories is on another street and there are residences right across from it, I could see that being an issue. But if you drive down Allen Boulevard, there are all kinds of condos, apartments that look like 2 stories from the front, but they're 3 or 4 on the back. What harm is that causing anybody? So that's why I'm reluctant, I'm leaning in favor of changing back to something like what Madison had or what has or what we had.
You mean either the front, the midpoint of the front of the parcel or the highest elevation?
Something that would not make us, make a developer take off.
Lop off half of.
Yeah.
And there's also a distinction, as you were giving some examples, Alderman Iro. It also made me realize, is there a distinction between when a lot has multiple street frontages versus when the rear facade doesn't face a street frontage at all? You know, there's potentially that distinction as well. So we could write the ordinance in relation to street frontage, or do we want the building to be in relation to any lot line? I'm not advocating that we make that distinction, but theoretically that could be another way, because Madison's ordinance implies that it's tied to street frontage. Whereas there's examples you can provide that what you mentioned, couple, but let's use Castle Rock since we were bringing that
Yeah.
up as an example.
Can we scroll down to?
Castle Rock. So Castle Rock, the north-ish side faces a residential neighborhood and not a street itself. But obviously there still is a height that could affect the solar angle, just as an example. So residents to the north of Castle Rock are looking at a higher building, which theoretically could, depending on setback, but that's why we have the step back provision to try and ameliorate impacts of that type. So
Setback provision is how many feet?
um,
And if it's, and it's relative to abutment to a residential district?
it's relative to the way it reads. Where the district abuts a single family, either low, medium, or high density, or a 2-family district at the rear or side lot line, then the building height at the rear or side yard setback line shall not exceed 36 feet or 3 stories. From this point, the building height may increase at a ratio of 1 foot of rise to 1 foot of horizontal distance, so essentially a 45-degree angle, up to the maximum allowed height. So again, intending to address potential impacts of solar angle primarily, and just feeling of making sure that someone doesn't feel overwhelmed by a tall building next to them at the setback line. So where a building abuts the street, Madison appears to have written it in relation to street frontage, but one could also consider it simply in relation to all lot lines, regardless of street
If
frontage.
you look at this picture, and at least on the left side of this picture of the top panel, this is Castle Rock, right?
Mhm.
That left side, that's where there's an abutment to residential,
Right.
because, I mean, I think most of us in the profession would say this is a 4-story building. I'm sorry, 5-story building. I can't.
I was gonna say, man, I gotta change
But
professions.
that on the bottom, that kind of beige area is perceived of as almost a story to the abutting neighbors.
Right.
But if we adopted the 4-corner average view, this building couldn't look like this. Some of those units on that left side those top units would have to be taken off.
With the assumption that we're talking solely about stories and not total feet, as we've discussed previously, we're going to move to exclusively total feet. But I would take the total feet measurement at the midpoint of this left to right. That would be the average.
How do the commissioners feel about this situation?
I'm still in favor of the average grade. I think that is the most universal way to give developers direction and deal with, all different types of lots.
So the four corners, regardless of,
With no adjustment in the average height for the degree of slopedness. slopeness, sloping,
I'll take slopedness.
slopedness.
Slopidity.
Yeah, because if you're referring, to the lot as is, who's to say that they haven't regraded before even presenting it to us to alter, I think that's why I'm in favor of the four corner average, because it gives them a solid tool to work with instead of property by property.
Then that makes me wonder, well, I'm sorry, Commissioner Adams or Art, do you have anything to add?
I was just gonna say, I don't oppose doing what Madison does, and it's using street frontage either, but I do see the point though of, the neighbors on the left-hand side of this picture, yeah, they're gonna see a pretty big behemoth, potentially can see who knows what that's actually gonna look like when it's all said and done, and how is that gonna make them feel claustrophobic, I guess, for lack of a better term there, but I also really don't have any quarrels against a midpoint or the four corners either. I mean, just don't feel like you want to lop off too much density. If that's we're looking at trying to be aware that we need to increase density, and you got to be careful of making sure we're not trimming it down too much. I think that Madison approach would still allow pretty decent density.
And I would oppose the averaging for that reason. I think we can come up with a better way, maybe closer to the Madison approach, or to the, you get 6 inches of average height for every foot of slope, whatever the term is, slopedness, right? So that you could build this Castle Rock like that, rather than having to lop off. Because otherwise we're going to have, on angled buildings, we're going to have really janky looking buildings. And I mean, that top story is really going to affect whether the project is financially feasible or not. And I don't know if we want to make it even more complicated by making some of it, a waiver or a conditional use. I don't like that. I think we want a clear rule so that an architect can know what building they can design on the property. I think Mark wanted to say something.
Well, I was simply going to point out that the step back approach that's built into our ordinance is lopping off part of the building.
Yeah.
I mean, so we actually already have that. It's just not lopping it off as far. So I just wanted to point out that a building of the sort that is in the Madison diagram, under our current ordinance, we would require that 45-degree step back. So we actually do already have the lopping off concept. I just, just to clarify.
It's a good point. Yeah.
If there's, when does that apply?
It applies.
I read
for-
it and
It says for any amount, when it's adjoining a single family or two family zone district, it's for any amount of height above 36 feet or 3 stories at the setback line.
So if the building in the Madison image were abutting another lot with the same kind of building, mirror image, they wouldn't have to step back. But if they were abutting a residential street, they would.
Correct.
Okay. You brought up conditional use, and I was thinking, what if we stuck with the interpretation of our current ordinance, but allowed for exceeding the building height limits, maximum building heights through, we deliberately didn't include a conditional use permit as an option because we figured let's incentivize developers to go with the net zero building or affordable housing. But I think if we wind up keeping the current definitions and interpretation, I think we need to allow for conditional use in circumstances like the Madison example, so that if they are in a position to, win over the neighbors, or maybe the neighbors don't mind because it is their backyards and they're not, spending time back there. I mean, it just seems like if one of our goals is to increase density throughout Middleton, we need to be able to allow developers to build
Yeah.
buildings like Castle Rock and not have to lop off the top. Just in case, just because we think somebody might object.
I shouldn't have mentioned conditional use because now that I think about it, I'm hesitant to add additional complexity. It should be pretty clear. Right, but it's also to manage the proximity to adjoining land uses so I'm convinced that with the step back that is required, we could go to the Madison approach where we just calculate the building height at the midpoint of the primary street frontage. The established grade
Mhm.
of this. So the way you drafted it, Mark, had established grade of the parcel rather than of the street. There's usually not much grade of the street. It's usually a good 12, 15 inches lower than the grade of the parcel if it's residential.
The Cariad building actually, just from memory, rises out of the ground quite a bit on the front, on the University Avenue side. And it wasn't quite clear to me what the black and versus green is supposed to show. And this is a 4-story, so let's assume that the maximum height allowed is 4 stories, just for sake of argument. Actually, that it's irrelevant. The point is, how tall is this building? I would here take an average and say this is essentially a 4.5-story building. I mean, the garage kind of sinks down a little bit. It's raised enough at the sidewalk to keep water from the street from entering the garage, but if any rain that falls on that driveway is still flowing towards the garage door, so I'm sure there's a drain there. So, but it is sunk down a little bit. So this building is, less than 4.5 stories. Something a little bit over 4 stories in height. And again, we're going to go to a total feet measurement instead. But on the back of it, it's the right corner there is lower. So again, 4.5 stories, and it's not entirely clear to me what the black versus green is, as I mentioned. But anyway,
That's not a story because it's not usable space.
well,
It's height, but it's not a story. I mean,
but if this were 5 stories more, as in the Madison example, or 4 stories more, as what Madison showed, a neighbor's going to perceive a much taller building, and a bigger than what they might expect with the ordinance of a 5-story building. The ordinance allowing a 5-story maximum, and suddenly it's 9 stories. I mean, we don't have many examples like that in Middleton, but University Avenue, the north side of University Avenue, drops away quite a bit around Castle Rock.
but if it abuts a residential, then it does limit
Have
it
that-
to 36
That's
feet.
true. That's
And
true.
so we're already protected with that. So this
Yeah.
is like doubly protecting, which we don't need.
Well, and again, we can make a distinction between whether there's, I think it was Alder Hanairo who asked the question about if you had a similar building next to it that wasn't single family or 2-family, could you have a taller structure there? And then, you wouldn't need the step back option. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, I have no problem with changing the ordinance to be more lenient instead of as restrictive as I'm interpreting it now. We just need to change the ordinance.
Either way, we need to change it because it's ambiguous.
Well, I don't think it's ambiguous right now. I think if I didn't give the interpretation that I have given already for another project, for a specific project, I feel like that could be challenged by someone saying you're violating your ordinance with that interpretation.
And so whatever change we recommend would then require a public hearing, go to council.
Right. And we, do have a laundry list of changes. This is one of the more substantive components of it.
How close are we to having,
There are
Being
other
able
items
to
that I
take
still need to
action.
go through with the commission. I was hoping to do that the next meeting. I figured we'd focus on this today.
well, I would, knowing that we already have the step back provision for the cases that we're trying to be sensitive to of residential neighbors looking at a back of a building, for example. As long as we know that's in there, I'm inclined to support Commissioner Paulson's suggestion to perhaps improve on Madison's, or at least improve on what we used to have.
Can we direct staff to prepare like two options? One of which reflects our old ordinance, just simple, if I remember, it was just midpoint of the frontage. And one which reflects the Madison highest point. Which, because Madison isn't just the street, it's whichever is the highest is where you start measuring from. I mean, we don't want to wordsmith a ordinance.
Right.
We just want,
Would you like to turn your question into a motion?
I think so, I guess, yeah, sure, so moved.
Did you get that motion?
So moved.
Okay, I will second it. I will so second it.
He said, the motion, as I understood, is to direct staff to prepare two options, one that is based on our old ordinance and the other based on Madison's. You said highest, but I think you just mean Madison's ordinance. Madison's ordinance.
28.134.
28.134.
Yeah, and I too have looked at various ordinances around the country, and some of them can get very complicated. Some of them say, take the measurement 10 feet from the building, and some of them say, take 10 points. I think one said take 21 points. I mean, I don't want to get into that. That's way too complicated. And that's why I was drawn to the one that I proposed, which was at some community in Utah. It just seemed very straightforward and the simplest way forward. But have no problem with providing these two examples for you for next time.
Okay. All right. So we have a motion and a second to direct staff to prepare two options
Who
for
was the
the
second? I'm sorry, I didn't
I
hear. the
was.
second. Oh, you did. Okay. Sorry.
for the Plan Commission to consider, one based on our old ordinance and another based on Madison's 28.134. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Is there anything else on the zoning ordinance that you wanted to discuss tonight, Mark?
Nothing
That's in
that
the
was in your packet. I think.
Okay,
I just had the examples, and we'll have to come back at a future meeting with others.
before we adjourn, I'll ask, is there any other business for the good of the group?
I would like to put in an item on the agenda for the next meeting so it can be noticed. To ask staff to prepare a brief informational presentation on the impact to the city of Middleton and our planning of the recent actions of the town of Westport to seek incorporation.
All right. You have that?
I'll get it off
A
the recording.
discussion.
Yep.
Informational presentation and discussion. Just, we need to think long-term what that means.
Yep. And as long as we're making suggestions, I wonder if at the next, maybe not the next meeting, but in the next month or two, could we get an update on the subdivision ordinance?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. All right. Any other suggestions while we're at it? Hearing none, we've reached the end of our agenda and we are adjourned. Thank you all.